On the night of May 3rd, 1897, a 43-year-old widow named Mary Titus lay in her bed inside of her house in the small town of Plymouth, Pennsylvania. And Mary, as she laid there, she just could not fall asleep because she kept hearing this strange tapping sound coming from somewhere in her house. Eventually, Mary just stopped trying to fall asleep altogether, and she just sat up and just listened really intently to figure out, where the sound is coming from. But she just couldn't do it. It was sort of erratic, and it seemed like it was coming from all over the house, and at one point it felt like it was right below her, and then it was over here. I mean, it really was hard to pinpoint where it was even coming from, let alone what was actually causing it. And then on top of that, the volume of this tapping was also changing. Sometimes it would get really loud, and then it would be super faint, and she could barely hear it. But it was still there, somewhere in her house. But then, sort of inexplicably, the tapping sound just abruptly stopped. Mary is sitting up in bed, it's 2, 3 in the morning, and it's just silence in her house. And at that point, Mary told herself, okay, well, clearly it was some animal, or maybe it's a branch tapping on the outside of her house or something. She's rationalizing the sound. It's gone now, so it can't be harmful, and I should just stop thinking about it and actually go to sleep now. But shortly after laying her head back down on the pillow, when she was almost asleep, she started hearing this sound again. And again, she just could not tell where it was coming from. Now, Mary, she was a widow, but she did have somebody else who lived with her in the house. It was her daughter, her 18-year-old daughter, whose name was Cora. Cora's father and Mary's husband had passed away tragically 11 years earlier in this terrible mining explosion. And really, even though it had been 11 years, Mary and Cora were still very much living in the shadow and the grief of, his death. This is something that they really had never been able to move past. And so as Mary is laying here in bed and she's hearing this tapping sound starting again, part of her thinks maybe it's Cora, maybe she's doing something. But really, what was going through her head when this tapping sound began again was how utterly alone she felt and how badly she missed her husband. Like, she really just wished he was here, because then she would have told him, hey, go investigate. I'm going to stay here. You go make sure the house is safe. But obviously he was gone. He'd been gone for over a decade. And so eventually, even though Mary really didn't want to get up and go look for this tapping sound, because truthfully, she was just scared at this point. But she's thinking about her daughter, Cora, who's downstairs, and, heaven forbid there's some problem in the house. Maybe an animal has literally gotten into the house, and it could be hazardous. She doesn't know, so she needs to go and be the brave one and go find out where the sound is coming from and make sure her daughter's okay. And on top of that, her daughter, Cora, had recently had this really bad case of strep throat, and while she was recovering, she really was not back to 100%. And so Mary told herself, this is an opportunity as much as anything to go down and just check on her daughter and make sure she's okay. And so finally, Mary musters the courage, and she takes her sheets off, and she gets up out of her bed, and at the same time, the tapping is sort of rocketing all around the house. It's all over the place. And right as Mary steps onto the ground, she's out of her bed, the tapping stops. Mary starts walking towards the door, and there's nothing. She gets to the door, she opens it up, she listens, she's looking out, but there's nothing. And the house is completely silent. And there was something kind of eerie about it. It's like the sound was responding to Mary's actions. And suddenly all of Mary's courage evaporated. And she thought, you know what? The sound has stopped. Everything's okay. I'm sure Cora's okay. I'm getting back in bed and I'm going to sleep. And that's what she did. She rushed back to her bed. She did not go check on Cora. She just got under the sheets, pulled them up to her chin, and just hoped the sound wouldn't come back. And it didn't. And eventually, Mary fell asleep. The following morning, when Mary woke up, she immediately kind of took stock and realized, okay, I'm okay, everything seems fine in the house. She listened and didn't hear any knocking sounds, and she quickly got up, she got dressed, she went downstairs into the kitchen, and Cora was actually already down there doing some needlepoint, and she seemed perfectly fine, albeit still recovering from her strep throat. But she was okay. She was in the kitchen in good spirits. And so Mary just kind of, breathed a sigh of relief here. Even though, again, she really has no idea what that tapping was. She has no idea if it was sinister or not. This could be totally benign. But there was just something uneasy about it. And so it was just really nice to come down here and have life be totally normal. And so pretty quickly, Mary just fell into her everyday routine. She began prepping some food for her and Cora to eat, and then she and her daughter just started chatting. At no point did Mary bring up the tapping sound, in part because she didn't really even know what they meant. She was kind of spooked by it, didn't want to scare her daughter, so it never came up. But they're chatting, having their completely normal morning, when suddenly there's very clear and fairly loud tapping that starts not in the kitchen, but below the kitchen, in the cellar. And as soon as the tapping starts, Mary immediately stops because she recognized it as the same sounds she was hearing the night before that spooked her so badly. And she looked over at Cora without saying anything, just seeing if maybe Cora heard the noises too. And Cora as well is looking at her mom like, did you hear that? And Mary's like, you heard that too? You heard that tapping? And Cora's like, yeah, I think it's coming from the cellar. And Mary, she's like, I could have sworn I heard that tapping last night. It was actually keeping me up. And Cora, she said, well, it sounds like it's in the cellar. Maybe we have mice down there and they're rummaging around or something. That's probably what it is. And so Mary, who at this point is desperate to find a logical, non-scary explanation for what's going on here, just immediately goes down the stairs into the cellar and begins looking for mice. That would prove that's all this is. It's mice making these sounds. But when she's down there, she's looking around and there's no mice, there's no sign of mice. And as she's down there, she starts hearing the tapping again. But now it's not coming from the cellar where they thought the sounds were originating. It's coming from somewhere above her. And as soon as Mary hears this tapping sound, she hears Cora reacting to it upstairs in the kitchen, like she was kind of startled by it. And so Mary runs back upstairs to the kitchen. She looks at Cora, and Cora is visibly distressed because she's like, I heard it. It was in here. It was in the kitchen or somewhere nearby. I didn't see anything, but I heard it. As soon as you went down there, I heard it. And so at this point, Mary is undeniably scared. She doesn't know what this is, but it's gotten to the point where she cannot deny there is something strange happening in her house. Her daughter has now fully corroborated that. And so Mary said, you know what? I'm going next door. They had a friend who lived next door, a guy that actually used to work with Mary's husband, who was sort of like their handyman and the guy they would call on to kind of help them around the house. And so Mary, she left her house and she went next door, knocked on this guy's door. And when he came, she explained that there's something happening. There's knocking sounds happening in my house. It's scaring me and Cora. We can't figure out what it is. Can you please come take a look? And he was like, absolutely. I'll be over in a second.
Hey, beautiful people. It's Evan Ross Katz, and I'm hosting the Beauty Official Podcast. I chat with the hottest guests about the most jaw-dropping moments from FX's The Beauty each week. Check out the Beauty Official Podcast on Hulu on Disney+, YouTube, or wherever you watch or listen.
And so Mary goes back to her house, and she and Cora are standing in the kitchen, and periodically they're hearing these tapping sounds. And then the neighbor, he comes over. He comes inside, and right away, when he comes in, he starts to hear the tapping too. And Mary's like, what is that? And Cora, she's totally spooked. And the guy's like, I think it's your pipes. I think that's all this is. It sounds very much like your pipes are banging against the wood inside your house or something. So let me just check your plumbing. That's probably what this is. And so Mary and Cora, they're like, great. Like, he seems pretty confident that that's all this is. And so Mary and Cora, they kind of hover around the neighbor as he begins to check the kitchen and the bathroom plumbing. But as he's checking all the pipes and the fittings and kind of looking for the origin of these strange tapping sounds, he realizes as he's checking all these different areas that as he's checking them, the tapping sound is persisting and it's not coming from the pipes. Sometimes it sort of seems like the tapping is coming from near the pipes, but other times, as he's working right here, the tapping sound is coming from somewhere else on the other side of the house. And eventually, Mary and Cora started to sense that the neighbor, who had come in very confident that this was no big deal, was starting to show signs that he too felt a little uncomfortable, like something was off here. And then, sort of out of nowhere, when the tapping got really loud, and it was now apparent, not only to this guy, but also to Mary and Cora, that the tapping could not be coming from the plumbing, because it's nowhere near here, it's behind us. And the man, he turned around, and he looked at Mary and Cora. His face is ashen, he really looked pretty upset. And he said, the last time I heard this sound was in the mine. It was when your husband was killed in that explosion. He died, but other men got trapped in the mine behind all this rubble from the explosion, and they couldn't get out. And they were tapping on the rocks over and over again until they all died. That's what this sounds like. After that, the man just got up and hastily left and just told them, I'm sorry, I can't help you. And he was out the door and back over to his house. And so Mary and Cora, they're left wondering, what do we even do? Who do we talk to? What's happening here? But for Mary specifically, even though she couldn't believe that this guy had just told her that, what a horrible thing to tell her. He knows she's grieving the loss of her husband. How could you possibly say that to me? But she's thinking about what he told her. That it sounds like the tapping of these doomed men, including her husband, tapping on the mine walls before they perished. And she started to wonder, what if These are ghosts. What if it's my husband and these men who died in the mines 11 years ago trying to get my attention? What if they're trying to communicate with me? Over the next 4 days, the tapping sound inside of their house continued. And the story about what was happening here spread all across town. In fact, all sorts of neighbors and actually news outlets were coming to Mary and Cora's house to hear the tapping sounds for themselves. And when they'd come in the house, Mary would walk them around the house. And sure enough, the reporters, the neighbors, they'd all hear the tapping sounds. And nobody could explain it. It was like this unbelievable phenomenon. And Mary and Cora, by this point, they were convinced that these sounds were very likely, Mary's dead husband and the other men who perished in the mine. Finally, on May 9th, so 6 days after this haunting began, by this point, the story is out in newspapers. People are talking about it all over the place. And in some ways, that legitimized Mary and Cora's plight. But they also really didn't know what to do about this. This had become sort of a spectacle, but nobody had any solutions for them. So Mary and Cora, they're sitting at the table weighing out their options. Like, what do we even do? Even if this is, our dead husband, our dead father trying to communicate with us, we can't live with this. This is kind of terrifying. And if it just goes on, do we eventually move? And so they're having that kind of discussion. And as they're sitting at the kitchen table, suddenly the tapping starts again. Except now, the tapping sound is so close. It's practically on top of Mary and Cora, so much so that their conversation immediately stopped when this tapping started, and they both kind of looked at each other like, it's right on top of us, what's going on? And then as this tapping continued, they realized it was basically right below them, almost like in the cellar, right underneath them. And so Mary sort of reflexively leaned back in her chair, just kind of trying to get out of, the bubble of this really intimate, close tapping sound that they were in. And as she's sitting back, she saw something she had never noticed before. And immediately, she understood what was going on. It would turn out the tapping sounds that were plaguing Mary and Cora were not being caused by Mary's dead husband or the other men that died in the mines 11 years ago. However, the actual origin of these tapping sounds was in some ways equally as bizarre. So Cora had recently had a bad case of strep throat, and she was doing better, but she still was feeling kind of under the weather. And that was in part because the bacteria that causes strep throat was still in her system. And that same bacteria is also responsible for causing a totally different condition known as Sydenham's chorea, which Cora also had. In fact, she had it likely at the same time that she had strep throat. And Sydenham's chorea has a very different set of symptoms to strep throat. This condition, which is also known as the dancing plague, causes your body to have these involuntary movements that the person who has this condition is often totally unaware of. These people can flail around suddenly and not even know they're doing it. And so what was happening is Cora was making the tapping sound, but had no idea she was making the tapping sound because it was being caused by Sydenham's chorea. Now, it seems like, well, how didn't Mary catch on that her own daughter is tapping her feet or flicking her hand and causing this tapping sound? Well, the reality was, when the tapping first started, a lot of times, Mary was not in the same room as her daughter. And her daughter did not know she was making the tapping sounds. So her daughter is genuinely scared of the tapping sounds because she doesn't know she's making them. And Mary doesn't know it's her daughter making them. And so combined, they're like, oh my gosh, what's happening in our house? And then before long, they had kind of gone down this path of, it's my dead husband, it's my dead father, he's the one making these sounds. And then it's like they had tunnel vision, as did all the other neighbors, as did the reporters. Everybody wanted this in some ways to be a haunting. And so nobody's checking to see if maybe Cora is tapping her feet or hands and creating these tapping sounds. Because again, Cora was fully convinced she was not making those sounds. But then finally, when she and her mom were sitting at the table discussing what they were going to do 6 days after the haunting began, and they hear this really intense, close tapping sound, when Mary kind of leaned back to kind of take stock of the room and figure out what was going on, she noticed under the table Cora's foot stomping on the ground. Cora didn't know it was Sydenham's chorea.
New episodes Mondays.
Even after all these years, I never tire of this view.
Your favorite community.
November of 2021, a middle-aged woman named Nicole Petit was on break at her job in the city of Decatur, Alabama. And while she was sitting in the break room,